In South Los Angeles, two Crip sets grew up so close that their borders almost touched, close enough that every rumor, every act of disrespect, every loss could travel faster than the truth. One side is known as the Rollin 60s Neighborhood Crips, a set that formed around Hyde Park in 1976. The other is the 83 Gangster Crips, often called 8 Trey, named for the 83rd Street area and rooted in the 1970s. What makes this story different is not one single incident. It is the way a rivalry turns into a tradition. By the late 1970s, public sources already described the Rollin 60s and 8 Trey as long-standing rivals within the broader Crips network, an internal conflict that persisted across generations. Tonight we are not here to score a gang myth. We are here to map the pattern, how proximity becomes identity, how identity becomes pressure, and how pressure becomes a cycle that outlives the people who started it. To understand why this feud never really ends, you have to zoom out before you zoom in. The Rollin 60s Neighborhood Crips took shape in 1976, formed around Hyde Park in South Los Angeles, inside the larger Crips network that began in Los Angeles in 1969, and then splintered into local sets. 8 Trey Gangster Crips, also known as 83 GC, grew out of that same ecosystem, centered around the 83rd Street area. Public reference sources describe the Rollin 60s and 83 Gangster Crips as direct rivals, with their conflict dating back to the late 1970s. Now add the real ingredient, proximity. In South LA, neighborhoods sit right on top of each other, blocks that look the same but mean everything if you grew up there. When borders are close, the smallest thing can turn into a statement, a tag on a wall, a color, a look, a rumor. And once people start keeping score, every new incident gets filed into an old story. The backdrop made it heavier. Los Angeles went through deep economic shifts in the 1970s and 1980s, with job losses and restructuring that hit working-class neighborhoods hard. Then the 1980s crack era reshaped street economies and intensified violence across the city. By the late 1990s, policing leaned heavily into anti-gang units like Crash. That approach was later stained by scandals such as the Rampart scandal, a reminder that pressure came from every direction. So by the time a kid is old enough to pick a side, the reason is already bigger than any one moment. It is reputation, memory, and pressure, stacked for decades. By the time people on the outside start paying attention, a rivalry like this has usually already gone through phases. Phase 1 is early tension in the late 1970s. Public sources on Crips history describe the Rollin 60s Neighborhood Crips and the 83 Gangster Crips as long-standing rivals, dating back to that era, which matters because it means the conflict is older than most of the people later representing it. In street terms, the beef becomes a family story, told, retold, and sharpened with every retelling. Period coverage described 8 Trey as one of the city's more violent gangs at the time, with investigators linking multiple homicides to the group and pointing to the rock cocaine economy as part of the context. In an environment like that, one incident does not stay one incident. The escalation loop gets faster, an incident, retaliation, then a rumor that sparks another incident. This is where the rivalry stops being just two sets and starts shaping the whole neighborhood ecosystem. Academic work on gangs in Los Angeles County describes the 83 GC versus Rollin 60s conflict as an active rivalry during that period. Rivalries do not stay contained. Friends, family members, and allied sets get pulled into the gravity of it. Even if someone does not want trouble, simply being cool with the wrong people can make them a target in somebody else's math. And here is the turning point that keeps the conflict alive. Once the rivalry becomes identity, peace can start to look like betrayal. The pressure is not always a direct order. It can be the silent expectation to answer disrespect, to do something, to prove you are not weak. That is how a neighborhood argument becomes a generational cycle. Over time, law enforcement attention often moves from individual cases to enterprise-style investigations. In 2025, federal prosecutors charged Eugene Henley Jr, described as a longtime Rollin 60s figure, in a federal RICO conspiracy case, according to reporting from the United States Department of Justice. Whether or not allegations like these ultimately hold up in court, the takeaway is simple. The consequences do not stay at the corner level. They scale up into federal courtrooms and ripple back down into the community. So when we say turning point, it is not one headline. It is the moment the pattern locks in, when every new incident is interpreted through the worst memory of the last one. When a rivalry lasts decades, the fallout is not just bodies and prison numbers. It is the quiet, everyday damage that never makes the news. For families, it can mean kids learning safe routes to school. It can mean parents checking who their children are with. It can mean whole blocks moving on a schedule shaped by fear. For local businesses, it can mean customers who stop coming after dark. It can mean owners living with the constant risk that one incident brings weeks of heat. And the longer a conflict runs, the response changes shape. In the late 1980s and 1990s, Los Angeles pushed hard on specialized anti-gang policing. Units like Crash became famous and later infamous after the Rampart scandal, a corruption crisis tied to the LAPD's Rampart Division Crash Unit that shattered trust and made cooperation riskier for residents. By the 2000s and 2010s, enforcement often shifted toward enterprise-style cases. Investigators mapped crews, money flows, and conspiracies instead of treating every incident as isolated. That approach can be seen in federal racketeering cases brought in 2025 against Eugene Henley Jr, described by prosecutors as a longtime Rollin 60s figure. According to reporting from the United States Department of Justice, prosecutors alleged a racketeering enterprise connected to the Rollin 60s and a non-profit organization. Henley pleaded not guilty, and the case proceeded in federal court. Even when cases remain allegations, they show how consequences scale. A street conflict becomes part of broader investigations, headlines, and court calendars. And the neighborhood still has to live through the day-to-day tension, because the real aftermath is not only what happens to the people charged. It is what happens to everybody who was not students, families, residents who inherit a war they never started. Here is the part that does not fit on a gang map. Most people living inside these borders are not in anything. They are just trying to get home. But when two sets sit close enough to share streets, parks, and schools, the rivalry does not need a daily reason to keep going. History becomes the reason. That is why the Rollin 60s Neighborhood Crips versus 83 Gangster Crips story matters beyond the names. Because once a beef turns into identity, it recruits the next generation with expectations, not invitations. You do not have to throw the first punch to inherit the consequences. You just have to grow up in the shadow of someone else's score. And the outcomes do not stop at retaliation. They widen into funerals, prison sentences, federal cases, and neighborhoods where trust is harder to rebuild than buildings. If you made it this far, you already understand this is not just a gang story. It is what happens when a neighborhood inherits a war. If you want more street history breakdowns like this, mapped, documented, and told without the hype, hit subscribe. And drop a comment. What rivalry should we cover next? And what part of the story do people always get wrong?